what's your background,
Yeah.
right? And this usually comes up when we're talking about training law enforcement and counterterrorism.
Yeah.
So in order to answer that question, you have to look at why is someone asking that, right? Because there is a lot of training out there that's being taught by individuals who are just not qualified to teach it.
Sure. Okay.
And when I say qualified, it's they may have academic experience, they may have read articles, they might have been in the military, but they have limited amount of knowledge when it comes to all the intricate details.
Okay.
What makes it different with me versus other folks is I grew up in the Middle East. Okay. And when I say I grew up in the Middle East, I grew up during a time where there was regime change.
Yeah.
Right. Meaning that there was a power struggle within the system in the country that I lived in.
Okay.
And once the country was taken over and the government changed, they began to enforce Islamic law, Sharia law. And the country is the Islamic Republic of Iran, which everyone who has a bit of an understanding of history can understand that in 1979, the Shah was basically ousted.
Yeah.
And the religious people came into the power, and immediately they changed the way the system operated. It's funny because at the time I was only 7 years old.
Dang.
Right? So
Okay.
I'm now getting into school, right?
Yeah.
I was there during the protest as a 7-year-old. It was really, for me, I didn't know anything about politics.
Well,
All I
sure.
knew is a bunch of people were protesting and,
You
out
saw the
with
chaos.
Shah, all the chaos, exactly. And then, Magbar America, Magbar Israel, basically death to America, death to Israel.
Yeah.
And as a 7-year-old, I'm like, well, what the hell are they talking about?
Yeah,
right?
well, sure.
And, I just knew there was a bunch of people running outside and doing all these protests. And to me, it was like, shit, I want to go see. Right?
Yeah, well,
so
yeah.
I would go, I'd like sneak out.
Go be nosy. Yeah.
I would like sneak out, right? I tell my mom I'm going out with the kids to play soccer, and I would sneak out like where the protest was. And I actually talk about some of these stories in my book, right?
Yeah.
And what ends up happening is as soon as the government takes over, immediately there's a change in the school system, right?
Okay.
So I'm going from getting into school, right? And it's just a normal school.
Yeah.
But then immediately there's a transition where it's like somebody puts the hammer down, right?
Okay.
I'll give you an example. As a 7-year-old, I'm walking to school, right?
Yeah.
And it's about equivalent to about a 1.5 mile walk, right? So I'm walking with all my books. And this is after the regime has changed.
Okay.
And for people who haven't been to Middle Eastern countries, when we're talking about a street, it's not like the normal street you would see here where, there's one lane this way, one lane that way, or 2 lanes and 2 lanes.
It's just like a paved road.
Yeah, and it may be like a cut of grass in between, right? Most of the streets there, if there are 2 lanes on one side, and I'm talking about city streets, I'm not talking about highways, right? So the city streets are almost like a boulevard looking.
Yeah.
And some of them, they'll have 2 lanes going one direction with shops right on the street, and then there'll be a walkway in the middle, right? And then there'll be 2 lanes going the other direction. So typically, people, unless they're shopping, they're going to walk in that center part of it, right? Because it's pretty wide.
Well, yeah,
it's
that
almost
makes
like 2-3 lanes wide. So I'm walking, and these 2 Land Cruisers or Toyota Land Cruisers, they come to a screech going in the fast lane and one of the, going away.
Yeah.
And I'm probably from here to, I don't know, maybe 25 yards from the next person in front of me. And they jump out, and there's 4 guys dressed in military outfit. And when I'm talking about military outfit, at that time, they called them Hezbollah, right? The Army of God.
Yeah.
And I learned later that actually there were people from PLO, from PIJ, from, some of these extremist groups that were there helping the Iranian government, I guess, put together a sort of an army. It's referred to as the IRGC now, the Sepah Hepastarán. Right? So they initially called themselves Hezbollah, or that's what people would refer to them as Hezbollah. So they jump out, and this guy, and I can't hear because there's, since they stopped in the street, there's a bunch of honking going on, right?
Yeah.
And unless you've been to the Middle East, our people just love that fucking horn. Okay, you can't go anywhere. Beep, 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 beep. I'm sure people up in New York City are familiar with that because every one of my cousins that drives a cab cannot lay off the horn. Okay, it's just the way it is. So with all this chaos going on because there's these two Land Cruisers stopping the road, I can't hear what they're saying. I just know that there's these four dudes in military outfit, and this dude standing in a meeting. All of a sudden, one of them brings up a machine gun and pops him right in the head and blows his brains out.
Jeez. Right in front of you?
Right in front of me. I'm 7 years old. And the first thing I think of is, oh, shit.
Yeah.
Right? I don't know what the hell was going on. I saw that melon pop.
Yeah.
Right? Think about this. At 7 years old, the only thing I can think of is, what the fuck?
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Not literally,
words.
sure, but
right.
You're baffled.
Words, but I'm just shocked.
Yeah.
And I'm in the state of shock, staring.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden, one of the guys just turns around and looks at me, and I'm thinking, oh shit, I'm next. I got all these books, and I freaking drop that shit, and I take off. Look like old Speedy Gonzalez, man. Or he's like, beep, beep, I'm going, right?
Yeah.
I ran all the way back to my house, and it was probably like a mile out, right? I left my books. I didn't give a shit. I was
left everything.
Everything. Well, so, I lived that particular environment.
Yeah.
But then as I was attending school, and it was about a year later or so when Saddam invaded Iran, right? So they didn't have a full military together, so they started training the young people, is what you refer to as child soldiers.
Yeah.
And depending on who you talk to, they'll say, well, it was voluntary.
Sure.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah.
Anything can be voluntary, right? But when you have a system that if you don't volunteer, you're going to pay a price one way or another. Sure, you could say, oh, they were volunteering because they're trying to help the Dola, right? But that's not the way it works.
If you don't mind me asking, what was like an example of this like routine change? Maybe like a training that you went through, or maybe you even saw.
Right.
Just like a little glimpse, not too detailed, but.
So let me lay this out. And this all goes back as to why, when we're talking about terrorism interdiction, why it takes someone who comes from the background that can give you insight. And you're talking about some of the training. So the way the schedule of the classes work, dude, I'm like 8 years old, right? And from the time when I was 8 years old till I was 14 and a half, this was like an everyday thing because there was a...
Dang, no breaks.
What I'm saying every day, like every year in school.
Oh, well, yeah. Okay.
So what you're looking at here is we went to school like 7:30 in the morning. We got out at like 11. Okay. And that was because you have to go do your afternoon, your lunch prayer, right? Iran's mainly Shia, so they break it up into 3 prayers. Okay. And we'll get into that as far as like the denominations and what the difference are. And so I would go home at lunch, or consider it lunch, 11 o'clock. And then I would have to be back at like 2:30. Okay. Right. And then we'd come back from 2:30. And depending on how old you were, and if you're a male or female, in the afternoons, you had like religious training where, specific people would come in, most of them in military outfit, right? Wearing like Hezbollah shit. Yeah. And then if it was like women, they would be teaching them, Quran and all this other stuff. Now, to be clear, just because they were teaching it for American people, you would think, oh, well, they're just going to church, going to Sunday school. Yeah. No. We're talking about things that are taught from an extremist point of view. Okay. Right? So if you were a dude or a boy, sure, it was voluntary, but it really wasn't voluntary. Yeah. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. So you were volunteering to go out to the closest military base. And at 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, all the way up to the age of 15, before you would get sent to the war at the time, you would be trained in how to take apart an Uzi, how to take apart an AK-47. Okay. And I even talk about it in my book, where we had to go out there. I was like 9 years old, right, in military uniform, right? Now I'll tell you this: for a 7, 8, 9-year-old to dress up in military uniform, like GI Joe kind of shit, it is kind of attractive, right?
Well, sure, yeah.
Because everybody wants a superhero, right? Any kid from any part of the world wants a superhero. Well, these guys are presenting themselves as the army of God.
They make it seem so cool.
Yeah, so all the kids are attracted to it anyway, because we don't understand ideology. All we know is, damn, that's some cool ass shit, right? So I'm out there with a knife learning how to look for landmines.
Dang.
Right. So 3 days a week. Every other day, that's what we would do. The other 3 days a week, we would have religious studies. And that's where you were told, this is what the prophet says, this is what the Quran says. Now, bro, you're talking about 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years old. And we're in a country that's Arabic is not a primary language, so it's not like anybody can just pick up the book and go, "Hey, wait a minute, that ain't what that shit
Yeah.
says." You're literally listening to these people who present themselves as some scholars, right? And I'm trying to summarize it. And what it's doing is it is indoctrinating the kids that this is the way life is.
Yeah.
This is what you're going to learn. So imagine 7, 8, 9, 10, all the way to the 15 years old. By the time you get to that point, you're already pre-programmed.
Yeah.
Number one, U.S. is an enemy. Number two, Israel is an enemy.
Yep.
Right? That's why they have flags where they're walking on the U.S. and Israeli flag, because they call the U.S. the Great Satan. Okay. And the Yahudi, right? The term Yahudi means Jew.
Okay.
Right? There's a difference, because you hear people saying, "Why is the Yahudi doing this? Why is the Yahudi?" Some people try to say, "Oh, well, we're not talking about the normal Jews. We're talking about Zionists." Well, there's a specific name in Arabic, Persian, pretty much everybody. There's a difference between Yahudi and Sahyuni. Sahyuni is Zionist. Okay? But they don't say Sahyuni. They say Yahudi. Okay? So it's imprinted in the child's mind that the Yahudi is the enemy. They're going to steal from you. They're going to do this. They're going to do this. So imagine growing up in that environment where you're constantly told that the Americans and the Christians and the Jews want to kill you, and that's what they want to do. By the time you turn 15 years old and you've been trained to do military stuff, what do you think you're doing? Oh, Saddam is empowered because America, because the Yahudi. So therefore, he's the proxy of the two Satans. So therefore, it dehumanizes anyone else other than people within your tribe. And I'm trying to put it in a tribal perspective. So when it comes to teaching counterterrorism, right, you can't have someone from the outside saying, "This is what happens. This is the process they go through." No, I live the shit.
Yeah.
Okay? Now, people are probably looking at this video going, "But this dude sounds like a fucking redneck."
Yeah.
Right? Oh, he's wearing a cowboy hat. Well,
Yeah.
I mean, shit. I'm in the South.
Yeah.
Right? So,
kind of ironic, but you know.
Right. And I sound like a redneck. That's because when I came here and I didn't know how to speak English, I came to the South. I learned English through progress of communicating with other people. Okay. I didn't learn English from an academic perspective. Because I learned the enunciations and the pronunciations, right? And to this day, there's still some words that I can't pronounce correctly because I'll get tongue-tied.
Yeah.
So that said, I've lived that environment. I've lived that indoctrination. Luckily, I had folks at home that when I had questions going, "Hey, you know, like my grandpa, hey, is this what this thing says?" And he'd be like, "No, no, 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 let me show you." And he would show me in the book where
he'd break it down.
Twisted. He would break it down as to why it's being twisted. Because what was happening is you get a lot of these people that get into this position of power and they start indoctrinating the children because they're bringing in political issues, right, to create that hate, but they're justifying it by altering the religious text.
It's like manipulation 101.
That's exactly what it is. And the kid, they don't speak Arabic. They don't know that.
They don't know any better.
Even in an Arab country, like what ISIS does, like what Hamas does, those kids, they don't understand how to do this interpretation because the Quran is written in Hijazi Arabic or classical Arabic, which is like poetry. And if you apply modern Arabic to it, it's out of context because there are other things that affect it. And I'm hoping that we don't get blown out. I just saw lightning coming.
Yeah, no kidding. It's going down.
Wow. The lights go out. So anyway, that said, when it comes to counterterrorism, I had to learn, especially after 9/11, that I grew up in an environment where it was Shia Islam. So to us, that was the only Islam. We knew about Sunni, right? But we didn't know anything different. Like, I didn't even realize until I was in my mid-20s that even within Shia Islam, there are different, they call them madhab, like schools of thought, right? Where there is a equivalent, kind of like an equivalent to a pope. The best way to parallel it would be like if you're looking at like Orthodox Christianity, right? Where you have the Roman Catholic Pope out of the Vatican, but then you have the Coptic Pope, let's say out of Egypt, right? Even though they're all considered, you know, Orthodox Christian, you know, as a collective, they all have different
practices. Well, maybe not practices.
Different heads of religious bodies.
Okay.
So even within Shia, there are several. Within Sunni, there are several. And
Okay.
then when you break down all the different denominations, there's close to 160 different denominations in
Dang.
the Islamic religion.
Wow.
When you look at the extremist ideology under both main sects,
Yeah.
you have to funnel your way through to determine, yes, they all hold the Quran as the pinnacle of the faith,
Yeah.
but as they interpret it, it starts to change depending on which one of the scholars they follow.
Okay.
And that is something where you have to be able to hone in and understand that if I'm dealing with one guy who's a Muslim,
Yeah.
first of all, which one of the main two sects?
Sure.
Second of all, which one of the subsects? And then once under the subsects, which one of the interpretations he
Yeah.
goes by?
It's super in depth.
It is. I have conversations with Muslims
Yeah.
all the time, Muslim police officers. And when I'm explaining this to them, they're like, holy shit, I didn't even think about that.
Really, not
It could be
most of them don't
Shia
even
or
know.
Sunni. And the reason for that is when you're born into a tribe, when you're born into a country or a specific region,
Sure.
you're going to practice what is prominent in that particular area, right?
Okay.
And I'll give you an example. Somebody is born into a family from a town of 5,000 people, let's say in rural Arkansas,
Yeah.
right? Most people would be Southern Baptist, right? So that person grows up, their introduction to Christianity is Southern Baptist, right? The difference is in the United States, you have internet, you can do that. Some of these people, they don't have access to the internet outside, right?
Yeah.
So they're not very much exposed to other people and other beliefs.
Okay.
So they grow up, let's say Southern Baptist, and then they make a trip out to Utah and they meet Mormons, and to them it's like,
Oh.
what the fuck,
Yeah.
right? Because they've never met a Mormon before.
Yeah.
The same concept applies to the Middle East because it's kind of tribal. So whichever tribe you're born into, that is the tribal culture and the tribal part of the religion you understand.
Okay.
All right. So that said, in order to figure out who's the cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs in the
Yeah.
Islamic religion, you have to figure out which one of these channels, which one of these organization charts do I have to go down because the crazies like ISIS, like Hamas, like Hezbollah, and to be fair, some
Mm.
are politically motivated, justified by religion. Some are simply religiously motivated, like ISIS and Al Qaeda and Taliban. They're straight up religious. They're like fanatic, fundamentalist,
Yeah.
extremist because of the way they apply things, right?
Sure.
So theirs is for basically making their region, their area, their continent, and then ultimately the world as Islamic State. While groups like Hezbollah and Hamas,
Yeah.
yes, they share some of the same misunderstood or misinterpreted religious text, but theirs is focused on a specific region, right? And groups like ISIS or Muslim Brotherhood, their plan is to, and you have this in every religion, their plan is to bring in the end of time to create that Islamic caliphate worldwide.
Okay.
Because once they're able to do that based on their prophecy, that's when the Antichrist will come.
Yeah.
Because they're the ones who preach, regardless. This dunya doesn't matter. Dunya means this world. So you live for the afterlife.
Okay.
Okay, so it's almost like they're trying to expedite. And you have that in every religion. You have that in Christianity, right? And then you have that in Judaism,
Yeah.
okay? Not to the violent part of it,
Yeah.
right? You're just talking about the violence because they're taking text that was in regards to conflicts that were going on, and they're trying to reinvent and recreate those conflicts now. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And literally, what I'm trying to do is I'm literally just giving you the tip of the iceberg. It's almost
For
like
sure. There's so much more you could dive into, but you're just giving me a broad thought.
right, because the class that I teach to get into the nitty gritty of all it's literally a week long class. Now that's not a class that your average Joe Blow wants to go to,
Sure.
right? This is more class for like,
People who actually care.
well, it's not even that. When you're talking about law enforcement, because this class, even though there's nothing law enforcement related about it, right? It's just a very, very comprehensive course on getting to know all the details. But a patrol guy doesn't need to know all those details because they're not going to be spending time long-term investigations and interviews and things like that, right?
Yeah.
They do need to know certain things because they're the ones who are going to be stopping the next ISIS operative that nobody's aware of, the intelligence community is not aware of, the FBI is not aware of, and a patrol guy just out there on the interstate making a traffic stop, he's going to be the one who's going to stop that guy. And he's going to have to know a little bit about it to know where's this guy's ideology, right? Is he going to be able to do anything about it on the side of the road? No,
Well, no.
because you can't put somebody in jail for their ideology. That's not the way the criminal justice system works in the United States. But you know what? You can be alerted to the fact that there's a problem here. And maybe I need to pass this information on to the FBI. He may be on their radar, because the one thing I've realized with law enforcement now is they are under the assumption that if they happen to run across a terrorist, that the damn computer in the car is going to tell them. There are terrorists in the United States who have come through the open borders and through, visa overstays
Nobody
and
has
stuff
a
like
clue
that,
about.
that nobody knows about, because intelligence is only as good as the information they receive. If these people didn't know who these people are, they wouldn't be in a computer, and those intelligence computers aren't accessible by your patrol guy and your low-level law enforcement officer, because they don't have the security clearance.
Sure.
Right? So, and that's where the problem comes in, is you've got a lot of people who want to learn, who want to counter the extremism that we're facing, because the danger is here. And I don't understand why people don't get their act together and start realizing that, especially cops. With the citizens, there's only so much they can do.
Sure.
Right? Citizens, the only thing they can do is go, hey, this is something odd. Let me call the police, right? Let them take a report. At least I reported. The whole see something, say something. But the cops, the law enforcement agency, and I'm not talking about like FBI, because they understand this stuff, right? They're just not the ones who are on the road driving around, stopping at the 7-Eleven, pulling people over, going to a burglary call, right? If the FBI comes out and they're running red and blue lights, somebody's house is getting taken down. You know what I'm saying? That's the time you're going to see them. They're not just patrolling the street. So guess what? The uniformed officer is the one who's going to come in contact with the potential threat. However, law enforcement agencies are just sitting there going, oh, well, the feds will handle it. The feds will handle it, right? And I've said this before. It's happened to troopers before, where they've stopped somebody who was a terrorist. Okay, for example, the 9/11 attack. One of the hijackers was stopped by a trooper less than 36 hours or 48 hours prior to hijacking the plane, and that trooper just wasn't aware. Why? Because the agencies aren't focusing on actually providing training from sources that can give them that insight. Sure. Is there counterterrorism training? Sure. Let's train our dogs to find bombs. That's counterterrorism training. Let's get our SWAT team to be trained by a former Navy SEAL, and nothing wrong with that, to know how to properly respond to it. Okay, that's fine. But what about the patrol guy? What about the patrol guy who's out there on the interstate just writing traffic tickets, right? Or, some trooper who's just a traffic guy who's working an accident, right? Or a criminal interdiction guy who has more training, right? That needs to pick up on these, but the training is lacking. Okay. So what about those? I put that fault on law enforcement administrators, because I can tell you right now, having trained 40 to 50,000 law enforcement over the last 20 years, they want to know. It's number one, the training ain't there. If there's training there that's of the same topic, it's not the same application. Like I said, it's like canine bomb dog, response to some sort of mass shooting. And the second problem is, when there is training, the first thing that law enforcement administrators say is, well, we don't have money for that. That's not our job. That's the Fed's job. And you know what? When 150 people get shot up at a mall because some ISIS cell decided to take over, some mall somewhere, some hospital, as the intel would suggest would happen, who are the ones responding to it? The law enforcement. Well, if law enforcement is responding to it and they're not prepared, they don't even know what to do. Even forget the response. What about if one of those guys in Atlanta stops one of those guys 2 days before, just like it happened with the 9/11 attack? If he doesn't know how to look for certain indicators, right, and how to talk to people and how to get into that mindset, he's just going to let him go. He could have literally thwarted the whole attack, just like that could have happened with 9/11.